Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another Research Roundtable with CIQ. My name is Zane Hamilton. I'm the Vice President of Sales Engineering. We at CIQ are focused on powering the next generation of software infrastructure, leveraging the capabilities of cloud, hyperscale, and HPC. From research to the enterprise, our customers rely on us for the ultimate Rocky Linux, Werewolf, and Aptainer support escalation. We provide deep development capabilities and solutions, all delivered in the collaborative spirit of open source. Today, we're going to have an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about HPC in the cloud. And I know this brings up a lot of emotion and excitement for people. So really looking forward to this. We can bring everybody in. Excellent. Welcome, Gary, Forrest. I think we'll have a couple others join here shortly. But let's start with some intros. Here's Greg. Gary, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Gary Jung. I'm the Scientific Computing Group Lead at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. My group runs the institutional high performance computing for Berkeley Lab. And I'm also the UC Berkeley HPC manager for their high performance computing also. So I wear two hats.
Excellent, Gary. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you specifically. Forrest, it's been a while. Welcome.
Thank you, Zane. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, it's a little quiet. Just a little.
There we go. How about now?
Better.
Cool. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Forrest Burt. I'm an HPC systems engineer here at CIQ. I've been here for about a year and a half or so now. Previously, I was in the academic and national lab space as a systems administrator for a few large-scale cluster systems at Boise State University and the Idaho National Lab. It's great to be on and great to be discussing HPC in the cloud. Very interesting topic these days. So,
Excellent.
Zane, hello, everyone.
Jonathan, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Zane. Are we doing introductions? Should I
Absolutely.
talk
Just
about who I am?
introduce
Okay,
yourself.
great. Yeah, so Jonathan Anderson, sysadmin in a past life, very many past lives, solutions architecture with CIQ.
Greg, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm with CIQ, Rocky Linux. Spent a very long time working with Gary at LBL and Berkeley. This topic has come up a number of times with many different contexts. So I'm really looking forward to this.
So looking through a lot of what Gary put in, I'm not even sure where to begin the topic, because one of the things that most people want to talk about, we talk about cloud, is cost. So I kind of want to save that for a little bit, because I think that could be probably a webinar in and of itself. But let's start off. Gary, how do you guys leverage cloud today?
So it's part of our portfolio for providing computing for the researchers. And so one of the things that we had done is we had put in place a master payer agreement so that to make it easier for researchers to use cloud. And because of that, we did that a few years ago. Then we've had quite an uptake on cloud usage. So right now, we have maybe about 200 users / projects on a cloud. And this represents maybe about 15% of our scientific workload.
That's interesting. That's actually higher than I was assuming you were going to say. Forrest, Jonathan, I know we run across this quite a lot, and that's kind of one of the reasons that we exist. So whenever we're talking to our customers, what are you guys seeing?
So kind of what I've seen in the space, especially in the academic sphere, is that it's really a bell curve in terms of people's utilization of the cloud. Some institutions are, in the enterprise level, the cloud is essentially ubiquitous. There's not a large enterprise out there today that isn't trying to use the cloud in some way or shape or form. But as far as, for example, one of the other major sites where a lot of HPC happens, academia, like I said, academic institutions form a pretty nice bell curve here. Some institutions are really, really involved with the cloud to the point where they're deployed on multiple clouds. They have, for example, in AWS, maybe they have like Lambdas and stuff like that they've set up. They're really, really involved with the tooling that the cloud provider provides to interact with our platform. So on one end, you have places like that are super involved. They've got, like I said, multi-cloud. They're interacting with the cloud tools themselves. There's a great middle where there's maybe some cloud operations going on. They've got maybe some GPU bursting, stuff like that going on to provide more capability for people around AI and stuff like that. The other end of the spectrum, and this is kind of where I originally came out of in the academic sphere, is where there's not really any cloud activity going on. Everything is basically traditional on-prem compute. You have a couple of big supercomputers at your data center somewhere else, and most all of your researchers are using those. So from what I've seen, kind of, like I said, in enterprise, the cloud is essentially ubiquitous. There's nobody that isn't using it. But across the academic sphere, it forms a very nice bell curve with some people that aren't using it at all, a lot of people that are kind of starting to get into it, and then some people that have major cloud operations going on.
Okay, thank you, Forrest. Jonathan, where have you been seeing cloud?
So mostly, again, it's similar to Forrest. My background is typically in kind of the academic side of high performance computing, and there I've mostly seen cloud computing used where it's been in an academic field that wasn't traditionally kind of co-evolved with HPC in the first place. And mostly these are a lot of them are GPU accelerated, because a lot of the complexity with an on-prem HPC environment comes from the distributed memory multi-node fabric part of it. So if you can get by, as a lot of big data workloads can, with increasingly dense single node workflows, then I see a lot of those come up scaling up in a cloud context, and then many of them tend to be what we would otherwise call embarrassingly parallel, and they can be spread out that way. So I see it more as a community thing. If you're coming from a community of a practice or an academic field that let's say is in humanities or big data or even genetics and genomics stuff these days, all of that's new to what we would call high performance computing, they're coming up through the cloud, and less in the traditional HPC environments, they see the benefits of a cloud computing environment, but there's a difference of technique between the two, and crossing that boundary is sometimes difficult in both directions.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to just point out before we move to John, to let him introduce himself and answer the first question. We would love to have you guys tell us your views on cloud, ask us questions, let us know how you are using cloud out there today. So, John, welcome.
Hi.
Introduce yourself briefly.
I got here late. Should I give a history of my use of the cloud?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I've been doing life sciences stuff a long time, and my first introduction to the cloud was in 2008-ish, when we tried to move a sequencing pipeline and an entire sequencing operation into the cloud, and it did not work. It failed miserably, and we burned through our introductory credits in a very short time. And since then, my entire career's interaction with the cloud has been migrating things back on-prem that should not have been put in the cloud in the first place. So I have a long history of experience bringing things back home from the cloud, not a lot of experience putting things into the cloud.
Well, I think that's going to lead to an interesting point whenever we start talking about cost, because that always seems the biggest driver of why things come back to the data center out of the cloud, in my experiences. But before we get into that topic, when we look at cloud and why people do it, I think it's always a question of why. I mean, we've talked a little bit about it. Forrest, Jonathan, you touched on it a little bit, of where people are coming from today, what they're comfortable with. But from an enterprise perspective or from a business perspective, why are people even looking at putting things in the cloud? Gary.
The cloud provides a lot of bells and whistles and convenience, and a lot of things are readily available. So we've done a few things to encourage the use of cloud. As I mentioned, we have a master payer agreement so that the researchers at our institution don't have to put up their credit card to do this. And so the institution first makes it easy. The other thing that we do is that we realize that there's just tons of services available. So even though it may be easy, once you know what it is, you don't know what it is. And so we do have consultants that provide consulting help to get users onto the cloud, so just to make the choice or figure out, we just ask them, what are you doing? And sometimes the cloud is the right use. And then we're seeing a lot of researchers who are younger who have used the cloud in college or in other places, and they come with that knowledge already. So they're really interested in just continuing using the tools that they have already used. So we have a number of reasons why people move to the cloud. And then there's other reasons that having to do with like resiliency, that maybe you may not be able to get as good of an uptime on-prem because you're not multi-site, for example.
Sure.
So I want to ask Gary a quick question. So the last time I was working with Gary, as we were talking about clouds and how to integrate with clouds, we were talking about kind of the pragmatic side of it, like how do you actually do it, right? How do you integrate with the scheduler? How do you create a uniform environment between on-prem and cloud? And how do you decide what jobs are best capable? Sounds like you've come a long way since I've worked with you on this, and I'm curious, kind of, how did all of that land? Like, what does the infrastructure look like, and what kind of jobs are running there versus on-prem, and data, and how do you handle all this?
That's an interesting question. That's more, what you're describing is more of a hybrid environment where you're using both. And what we're doing in our case is a lot simpler. Is that some researchers are using the cloud exclusively, or the amount of integration between on-prem and cloud is not what you would want. It's because it's a very difficult problem. I think that there are solutions that are coming out, but they're either expensive or they're complex, or it's not an easy thing to say, oh, my on-prem, I'm just going to burst to the cloud. People say that all the time. I think it's that, oh, we'll just do that when we need to use the cloud. And I think that's a harder problem to solve than people make it out to be. And so to get to your question, then our usage cases are more like we'll pick a certain use cases and stick them in the cloud entirely. And they may be that somebody wants to do something, and auto ML may be the right tool for them to do something quick and easy with that. And so we'll do that, and then it'll run entirely out there.
Is it a completely it sounds like then it's a completely separate instance or cloud HPC system that you kind of built? Did you build a Beowulf style system up in the cloud?
We've done that too. Yeah. So people have asked for that, or people have, some things work well in a cloud. Some people, like our physicists, or there's a lot of domains where they're generating a lot of data and they want to make the data available for download to other people. And, that's kind of like a variable workload that kind of works well with the cloud, because you can auto scale for that. And then when you're not, you do the data release, a couple times a year, and you need a whole bunch of compute power for that. And the rest of the time, you hardly need anything. So, so there's things that we will choose to put out there, and they seem to work really well for the cloud, on the cloud.
Cool. Thanks.
Sorry, interesting. And I've got a question about that. Whenever we get to the cost part of it, Gary, it's an interesting problem that we see a lot with cloud, is when we start talking about egress data or having people move data out. So I have a costing question about that. But Dave DeBonis actually did point out a good point. People move back to the data center out of the cloud, not only for cost, but also for control. So John, I'm assuming that's a little bit of some of why you're doing it. People like to call it shadow IT. I'm assuming there's shadow HPC as well.
Yeah, most of the stuff everything driving what I do to migrate stuff back is always around cost. It's never around control or capability or anything. I mean, at the end of the day, a job is an application. An application runs on a computer. Where that computer is irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter how the application got started as long as it runs. So the control thing I don't really understand in the direction of migrating back on-prem. I do think a significant amount of work makes it into the cloud, strictly because that's the place where the person trying to do the work can avoid their local IT organization or their local HPC group that is not getting their stuff to run correctly. That is a more insidious problem to me, because that's stuff that going to the cloud that doesn't need to go to the cloud, because it's just getting around local politics. And I've ran across numerous examples of this over the years of people who were using the cloud only because due to policy, that's the only place they could get a machine they can actually control and make work.
That makes sense. And that's what I've seen as well. I mean, from the enterprise side, it's always getting around policy. That's always been the thing. And you end up having data that's in places that it probably shouldn't be or is not supposed to be somewhere like the cloud.
Yeah. On the cost side, though, maybe somebody here can explain this to me because this one blows my mind. At my previous employer, we were given a go all cloud directive to move entirely into the cloud. And we very easily and conservatively showed that it was going to be a 10x cost increase to go to the cloud. And people whose titles start with C, their answer was, we don't care. It's OpEx, not CapEx. So I want to know out there in the world, why is OpEx free money and CapEx is not free money? Because I've asked this question many times. Nobody can explain it to me, but this has repeatedly come up as a reason to go to cloud is because you can pay for it with OpEx.
I don't have a great answer for you, but I've seen that as well. And I've only seen it last for short amounts of time. Usually within that first year, they realize they're paying a lot more money. And even though it's OpEx, I've seen that stuff come back time and time again, just because.
Yeah, I mean, it inevitably boomerangs, but I don't understand the thinking that gets us to throw that boomerang. I've never been able to grasp the accounting side of it.
So my impression and experience of this from having that same conversation in the past is that one, it's easier for the finance people to budget for. So if you're doing cost recovery in an academic situation, or if you're rolling your costs into a profit margin, that it's easier to see the incremental costs of those things and apply them to whatever you're getting money back in from. And the second is that you can stop paying for an OpEx at any time. Whereas if you pay all up front for a capital expenditure that you stop using, that money is sunk into that resource and you can't recover that as easily.
So, I mean, to your point, John, it is some accounting magic to use Tim's comment. Absolutely. But what I've seen on that is people have their budgets and they talk about they can budget. One of the cloud migrations that I've done before, they budgeted, and I think we talked about this before, about $800,000 a month. And they got their first bill and it was almost $3 million. So even budgeting was off and they were okay with it for a very short amount of time, like I was saying earlier, John, and then they pulled it all back in. It didn't even make it a year before it was, oh my goodness, we can't even budget this because it was way higher than what we had anticipated and spent a lot of money just trying to figure out what we were going to have, and we were wrong. So
and to be clear, when I say easier to budget, I don't mean actually, I mean to write the numbers down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Gary, I don't know if that's the budgeting part of it. How
I might say something that might not come across well to people who are in the position of making decisions, but I feel it is just a tougher thing to do politically to try to get a large funding for a large capital project. And so that could take sometimes years to do and a large workup to do that. So I think going to an OpEx is more of like a solution where you're kind of backing into it, where you don't do the right thing, you do the default thing, and that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think clearly a lot of the drivers. I mean, I kind of tongue in cheek mentioned getting around a bad IT org and controlling your machine, but I suspect a lot of cloud drivers are political and policy based, not technical, right? You're not going to the cloud for technical reasons. You're going to the cloud to get around exactly what Gary just said. If you propose to build a cluster on a campus, you will be inundated by people who know how to build a cluster better than you, who want to build that cluster instead of you, right? Like this is a bike shed problem of all bike shed problems. And you can avoid that by just taking your money to the cloud and spending it one time and, walking away with your result.
Forrest is laughing. I'm assuming he's never seen that before.
it would seem to be more psychologically palatable to people to pay some small amount for disposable instances in the cloud to pay some small amount every month for disposable instances in the cloud that can be spun up, spun down, and there's not really much attached to them. It would seem it's easier and more palatable to for some people to be involved in a model like that, to, as Gary kind of touches on, spend the multiple years that it can take to plan a cluster, the couple of years or so it can take to plan a cluster, to get all that budgeting in place. It would seem that, from what I've seen, wanting to put together, for example, a cluster, there were huge financial considerations with, as I think I've touched on before, even in the academic space, like where the equipment was sourced from and stuff like that. We can't go buy an entire cluster from one place. The government would prefer that you piecemeal it out to 20 different companies, and then, because that's how their contracting works. So it would seem, basically to echo what Gary said there, it would seem like, the actual effort that it takes to stand up a cluster and the permanence of that type of thing, everybody names their clusters, but who actually names their, cloud instances or whatever that they're using for something? And so in the end, there's a lot more, permanence attached to, perhaps this is an obvious statement, but in the end, there can easily be a lot more psychological permanence attached to an actual machine that you've named and you've built from the ground up and you've spent so much time working to create, than there is with just, seemingly disposable cloud instances that are a lot cheaper and a lot more disposable.
That's a really funny point, actually. Gary will remember this, that when a scientist actually takes their researching funds to actually go build a system, not only does it get named, but it gets photo opportunities. So they actually take photos with it, standing next to it, you touching it, and and posing with it. There is something very psychological about kind of having that physical resource that you've just spent a huge amount of money on, and then knowing that this is going to be used for our science, for solving this problem. It almost turns that into a tangible win, in a matter of speaking. So I completely agree with that. I think we just lost Forrest.
Yep, lost Forrest.
That's funny you mentioned it. I actually took one of those photos last week.
It's a real thing.
It really is. It really is. They show the program managers. They show, this is what we're doing. This is, look at what we have. Then they wrap it all up and what they're accomplishing for with the dollars. It's part of it.
So I've held the opinion for a while that I think that they're, I'm not quite as far negative to cloud as John is. But I definitely have had my share of complaints about it. And again, I'm very pragmatic when I look at things. And the complaints that I have are just about what makes sense. Like, how do you do it? How do you implement it? How do you put together a system that really does make sense and drive science and drive research and solve problems? And the main issue that I've had with cloud for so long is it's a mandate from management, coming from above, coming down, saying we have a cloud initiative and we have to solve this cloud initiative. And not a question of, there's this cloud thing, how cool is it and will it solve our problems? It's more like, we need to be buzzword compatible. And I'm not talking about LBL or DOE right now. I'm just talking in general, right? This is I've seen this over and over and over again. And I think, though, if we look at it from a pragmatic perspective, there's this thing out there with supposedly infinite amount of resources, or at least that's what they like to tell us and like us to believe. There's this infinite amount of resources. It's more expensive. We have to deal with data. We have to deal with movement of jobs and whatnot. But is there a way that this can be a valuable resource to science? And how do we maximize that resource?
Yeah, I've been saying for a long time that the value of the cloud, like people talk about, Greg, you're talking about the infinite pool of data, and people imagine scaling up infinitely. And there are certainly, again, in our CapEx versus OpEx argument, there are ways that is a good thing, where if you're building an application that serves the world and you want it to be able to elastically scale up as the world comes online. But if that's not your business model, To me, the benefit of the cloud is that you have a functionally infinite like quality of product. If you can imagine, you just kind of divest doing it properly to someone else, but now you can carve the tiniest slice of it off and get all of the benefit of someone else having done everything the right way, and you can scale down to a small prototype level and still get all the benefit of that huge infrastructure. So where I think the benefit of the cloud comes in for research computing and even high performance computing is where you have new workloads and new workflows, new research interests that aren't certain whether they fit into any of the traditional like existing on-prem infrastructure. We're talking about cloud versus on-prem, but to me, it's kind of, there's a two-dimensional matrix where cloud can mean either someone else's computer, or it can mean the new culture of kind of API-driven compute and infrastructure as a service. That can exist on-prem too, but maybe there's some new way that someone's going to construct an infrastructure that better fits their research or their workflow. That's something that's easiest to do in the, you know, imagined infinite thing that I can take a tiny piece of and do whatever I want with it. And you know, that's what John was calling getting around policy. But if you do that intentionally, where you're like, we don't have a solution for you yet, go play over there, do something that works for you, and then once you have it, we'll help you scale it up. And chances are, if you have a large but relatively fixed workload that you're working towards, that's going to mean bringing it back on-prem. But you got a lot of value of not doing the wrong thing and having to buy a bunch of infrastructure that wasn't the right thing, and just having to keep it long term.
So I'm going to jump in on that note, and this is a little bit of a loaded question because as those of you who have been following for a little while know, we've been working on this problem. But I am kind of curious, like, how do, in a more traditional sense, how are organizations giving cloud access to researchers kind of as like an introductory or like you can't just give the cloud resources. You got to install the operating system. You got to install all of the applications, the libraries, the connectors for between inter-process communication. Are you running a schedule? I mean, like, there's a lot of shadow IT costs that now come in, or shadow HPC costs that come into play when doing that. So you can't just hand over cloud resources, at least effectively, to researchers generally. So how do organizations make that simpler for people?
I mean, we're looking
It's
at that from.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
That question comes from a state where HPC is a mature concept inside of an organization. But if we go back even just 10 years, especially like 15 or 20 years, even with what we call HPC today, the answer to that was you give them grad students and you have them figure it out and do it. And that still happens with what we would call traditional clustering. Like, why not? If you're talking about that early stage where you're doing a new thing, like, you can't scale that. You have to just throw people at it. And the cheapest people are grad students.
Hi, and St. Duck says we build our own internal cloud for researchers. And that's something that I've been running across more and more in the conversations I've been having. And Forrest, you and I have talked about this quite a bit when it comes to the cloud. And there are a lot of things that places that the hyperscalers can actually purchase some of that more expensive hardware, and you get to go play with it for the first time and see, does it really make sense to bring back in? I think, Jonathan, you kind of alluded to that, but I know that you and I have talked about that, and I think you've seen that before where people are doing that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
As far as building out an internal cloud for people?
Internal clouds, and then being able to try things in the hyperscalers in the cloud before they make the investment on-prem. So kind of which leads into hybrid clouds. We'll talk about that next. But
I have not personally seen so much like kind of internal cloud type stuff being built out. Like, I haven't been involved in a lot of that personally. But I know that it's becoming more and more of an interest to places as they realize that they can invest in their own infrastructure and provide those type of capabilities similarly to the cloud. But I would actually say in general, I haven't like worked a ton with that personally those type of internal clouds. I'm sure they're out there, especially with, well, some of the cloud providers starting to provide their own appliances and stuff like that, so people can even stay on some of their platforms. I'm sure it's going on, but I think I would more so equate that with the concept of on-prem computing than an internal cloud, I suppose.
It's been interesting because I've talked to several people recently that have open stack environments. So what you think of is from a on-prem cloud in the enterprise. So Rose has a good question. I will open this up to everyone. Please share your favorite names of HPC. Greg, I know you have a favorite.
I got a good one. And my whole goal with putting up my hand and whatnot was just so Gary doesn't get it before me. So when I was at LBL with Gary, when we ordered clusters, they would typically come fully built and assembled and in racks, and they'd be integrated or merged, coming out of the merge center or whatever, depending on our vendor. And they'd come in racks, and you basically roll them in. Worst case scenario, sometimes you just get pallets of nodes, and you got to put the nodes in to the rack. And many vendors would do that. We ordered one cluster, and I'm going to say not mention the names to protect the guilty. But we basically ordered this one cluster from a vendor we didn't order from before, a big tier 1 vendor, and it came in. They won the procurement, they won the deal. They came in, and it came in on pallets. Like nothing was integrated, like PCI cards, memory chips, everything was in separate boxes. It was a gigantic. When we were done with this, the amount of extra cardboard that we had to deal with and whatnot and recycle was massive. So we called it IKEA.
Yeah.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, you stole Gary's story, but Gary, do you have a favorite other than IKEA?
Oh, yeah. You mean about clusters, about building clusters?
The name of a cluster, yes.
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to give that some thought. We've built a lot of clusters, Greg and I. In fact, I was just like adding it up the other day because I was trying to like recall them all. But over the course of the last 20 some odd years, we've put together 65 clusters.
No way.
Yeah, a lot.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
We had one, I'm not going to mention the person's name because the scientist will be, but we had one system, this was early on, that got broken into. And when we rebuilt it, we didn't know what to call it. So we named it the PI. And so we had a cluster named a PI, the PI. So I'm sure that made very interesting conversations to their internal group meetings.
Oh, that's fantastic. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll share one about me. I'll say one that didn't make it, and then I'm glad it didn't. But we decided we have a cluster that's being built right now. In fact, Dell was on site installing it in racks yesterday. So as Greg would say, they would do these large procurements, and they'd come in and do the installation and the wiring and everything. We thought we would let the people in the researchers name it, and so there was a poll, and I won't say who it was, but I'll say that the second place name was Cluster McClustyface. And so I'm glad that it did not make it as the number one.
Oh, that's great.
Since I worked at Kaus was the last time I was involved in a big deployment of a single machine. And so now I don't name clusters anymore. I name environments because the environment grows over time and nodes come, nodes go, and the OS gets upgraded, but we never have a single large deployment anymore.
That works. All right. So I think
did you see Todd's comment? That was very funny.
That was fantastic.
Black and blue.
Thank you for the comment, Todd.
And yeah, we've actually had clusters almost fall off the truck as they're unloading them, and sometimes it's really scary. But yeah, yep, that happens.
I had a server get delivered one time that forklift had put a fork through the middle of the server, and they still delivered it and put it in a rack. Didn't work. All right, so I think it's time to have the cost conversation. I figure this one's going to probably spark some interesting conversation. I'm going to start with John, because I know this is the reason that you're pulling stuff back into the data center is cost. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to say there. It's objectively more expensive to run in the cloud for a lot of workloads, and life sciences being one of the ones that's like a poster child for that. So anything that we do, assuming you have the sunk cost of a data center space, then anything you do is going to be more expensive in cloud than it would be to do the same thing on-prem. The cost that bothers me most about using the cloud, that I'm absolutely evangelical about, is the opportunity cost you lose when you spend your money in the cloud. And that was driven home to me yet again today as I listened to a presentation of a project at BioHub that moved back on-prem from Amazon. And they cut their pipeline time from days down to 11 hours. The cost for them effectively went away because they're running on-prem on our cluster now. And the last comment they made when they were explaining this was, and now we no longer fear reprocessing data when a new algorithm comes out or we want to try something new. And that's the opportunity cost that is lost when people spend their money in the cloud. If you buy those machines and put them on-prem, you can always use them for something. But that doesn't apply when you're paying by the hour. And that's the thing that I really hate to see scientists that should be using their brain power to do science worrying about how much is it going to cost when I hit the enter key.
Absolutely. So Gary, I know we talked a little bit earlier about people wanting to allow others to access that data. And we look at cloud, even if you have, we'll talk about committed spend in a minute, but that data egress fee, does that become a problem when people start pushing data back out, having other researchers come in and pull that data down?
Yeah, so we're part of a large, Berkeley Lab is managed by University of California. And so we could take advantage of academic discounts. And so without actually saying what the discount is, I can say that a lot of the discounts for between academic institutions and cloud providers, they usually will waive a percentage of they'll waive the network egress cost so long as that your compute spend is less than a certain percentage of your compute spend. And so the egress cost for us goes away. And so that's not an issue for us.
Interesting.
But it could be for others. But for us,
I've seen very large egress data bills from enterprise where you move stuff in, you don't realize, you try to pull it back on-prem, to John's point, and you have a massive bill that you weren't anticipating, which is kind of what Insane Doug just pointed out, the egress bills being very high and they catch people unaware, off guard.
I have about 2 petabytes of data right now that I sent to Deep Archive because it was too expensive to bring it home, that I just realized I'm going to bring home through Gary's cluster.
There you go.
Problem solved.
Great idea.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that has become interesting from my perspective over the last several years is these large hyperscalers go in and make agreements with companies. And it is typically, you have a committed spend. It's usually a very large amount of money that you're going to spend. And Gary, I'm thinking maybe this is kind of what you guys are in, that you have a number you've agreed on. This is what we're going to commit to spend to you over this period of time. But I've always seen that from the enterprise side and not from the HPC side. And I can see some of these higher end resources. I mean, Forrest, you and I talked about how expensive some of these GPUs are in the cloud. You could blow through that amount of money pretty quick. So I'm just curious, from your opinion of that, is that something that would help make it easier, or is that something that could possibly make that next bill even bigger? Is it a good thing?
So just to make sure I understood, is it something where you're kind of like cost averaging, or where you're committed spend so that you're committed to a certain dollar amount? Is that
you're basically buying a discount, Gary? So you commit to whatever, $20 million over the next 12 months. I get so much resource. Anything over that I pay for, but I get such a massive discount of what that $20 million will buy me. So it just kind of becomes a free for all. But I can see in a large research environment, if it's considered a free for all and you can do whatever you want, the resources are typically very heavily discounted, that you can still blow through that pretty quick. When you're doing web services, maybe not as much, but some of these high-end GPUs that cost thousands of dollars a day, that could go fast.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, we have something like that we're trying out with one of our providers where we've looked at what the spend is, and we said, okay, let's set a number and of based on history what it should be, and let's lock it in. That's what it's going to be the next 12 months. If you run under, it's still the same amount. If you go over, it's still the same amount, and so what it works out well is that then people who do blow through a lot, or their cost overruns, or their mistakes, which do happen, where people have made some very expensive mistakes, then you're protected against that. And the only thing that we caution people is that we renew it. The plan is to renew it at the end of 12 months, and for us that'll be coming up in December. And then we'll look at what the usage was, and it'll reset to whatever that is. And so if everybody was just going nuts because it was at a fixed rate, then, when we go to re-up, then the bar is going to, that dollar figure is going to be a lot higher.
So Gary, is that something that everybody watches over time, so everybody can kind of see where you are in that process? And this kind of goes back to John's point earlier. Does that make people nervous, especially that last month or two of that contract, nervous to hit enter, to submit their work?
Yeah, this is our first time doing it, our first year. So, so we're looking, the spend was X, we set it at X, and it looks like, when we renew it, that, based on usage, it has increased enough that the base level will be 2X. And so that means everybody was paying roughly about a fixed amount, because we proportion it out to all the researchers, but they're roughly going to be paying about double for their cloud usage. So they may have started off, not using a whole lot, and then they ramped it up, and they probably were thrilled that it was cost them the same amount, but now they're going to be hit with a bill where it's going to be twice as much.
Interesting. Forrest, Jonathan, are you running across these types of conversations when you're talking to customers and doing POCs and implementations about cloud usage and fear?
So far, from a customer perspective, what I've encountered are people that are already pretty well down one path or the other. And maybe they're talking about, either that, or they're in one of those camps and they're wanting to go hybrid, but it's not to the point yet where they've encountered that fear. So not really yet. Forrest, anything that you've seen?
In general, I find that from the people that I discuss this with, they're generally pretty well aware of the costs associated with both traditional HPC and the cloud. They're pretty aware of the fact that you can easily burn through that budget. So for the most part, what I see is more so an excitement about moving to the cloud and kind of seeing what those possibilities are, more so than I see apprehension from the sysadmin side. There are definitely concerns about the cost, but in general, the theme is more so we're aware that the cost of the cloud can come up, but we're interested in seeing anyway how this can end up improving our operations. So there's a concern for cost, but there's definitely an excitement about the possibilities of the cloud and what it can end up providing for them that makes it worth it for them to investigate in spite of that apprehension.
Thank you, Forrest.
Gary, one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of how to, alleviate some of the fear around the possible future billing thing. That's the story that I always hear, is people did a bunch of work, didn't realize how much it was going to cost, and we say blow through budget, but really they get a huge bill that they weren't anticipating. That's all this post-pay model where you kind of get whatever compute you ask for, and then at the end of the month or whatever, a bill appears. Are you aware of anyone offering any kind of prepay model? Even in on-prem, when we were doing resource allocations, I was always a proponent of not just trying to, theoretically bill people after the fact, but always having a bucket of allocation that they have access to. And then if they run out of that, their jobs don't run on the cluster for the month or whatever the period is, or maybe they deprioritized or something. Are any of the hyperscalers doing that, where you can put money in a bucket per account or something like that, and then their instances just shut down when they run out?
Yeah, what we're doing is, we've had, as I mentioned, we've had an instance where there was a big cost overrun, and then so we do have set limits on so that this way they, we'll try to set some kind of reasonable limit, and you have to do it per project, and so that this way it won't run past a certain point, or you'll get a notification. Is that what you're asking?
So is that an actual hard limit where it will stop and not bill past that, or it just says, hey, by the way, you're exceeding your budget and you might want to take an action?
I think we set it up as a hard limit. I think it is.
That's cool.
But I'd have to go back and check. I'd have to check.
I can assume that would upset people if it just hard shut off, but it is a great way to make people pay attention a little better.
And it depends on what you want. If you're approaching this and you're like, I would want to do cloud computing stuff, but I have heard these stories about these unexpected bills coming in, then having this available to you would give you the confidence that you can do whatever you want and you're not going to wake up to a huge bill.
Yeah, we the cost overrun thing is real, and it's like could be tens of thousands of dollars in a short order, and depending on the institution, the amount of cybersecurity you have for people running in a cloud may not be as good as what you have for on-prem, because you're on a campus or institution where you have some kind of network perimeter that you can monitor and you can see all kinds of stuff. But if you don't necessarily have that visibility into the cloud, so a cost overrun, somebody starts hitting something really expensive like BigQuery and it goes nuts over the weekend, or the other one, as I was starting to say about the cybersecurity, the hackers, somebody hacks into this, then that's a great place for them to get some free crypto mining done, and that could run up really fast. And so you having some kind of hard shut off is useful, because the dollars can rack up in hours.
Absolutely. So Gary, where do you see the future of scientific research in the cloud? Are we there? Are we kind of at that point where we are where we are? Or do you think this is going to become more prevalent, more stuff's going to move to the cloud? At some point, is it going to take over on-prem, where most research goes to the cloud?
We're seeing we're kind of moving into this just past doing computation, and so before, for small researchers, running just in the cloud or just on-prem, then that's not a difficult problem to solve. But when you're hosting large collaborations, people now expect, if it has some kind of web presence, they expect it to be up like all the time. And so where you might have not had the availability on your research cluster that you would have on your enterprise systems, now we're starting to see expectations where that people want that reliability and availability. And so that means, accounting for outages due to, work on a data center or your campus or your site, or, or because of some kind of natural disaster, multi-site. So we're seeing people start thinking a lot more about that when they're talking about large multi-site collaborations, about the availability, and sometimes you're just limited by what the site that you happen to be located at. So we see interested people do that. And then the other thing is that large collaborations now don't just do computing in one place. There's more of a move to use computing wherever. So they're doing multi-site collaborations and a portfolio of computing. And so having something available and reliable all the time that can reach out and use different computing at different places, a cloud could be a good place to, like, say, be the locus for that, and then make use of the other things. So I kind of think the tools that are coming out, I know CIQ is working on some really interesting stuff that makes it location independent. So I think we're getting a lot closer than we ever have before, and it would be nice if we can get to something that's truly hybrid, but more suitable for scientific computing, and at a cost that people come to expect for scientific computing tools, as opposed to, like, say, enterprise tools. So people do multi-site computing for enterprise, but the tools are just cost prohibitive for any kind of scientific research institution.
Thank you, Gary. Greg, where do you see the future of cloud and HPC?
I kind of alluded to this earlier. From my perspective, it's hybrid. I mean, we really have to figure out how to do this in a way that is transparent to users, to researchers, to whatever the sources of the jobs are, and come up with really good ways of doing, I don't know if we call it meta orchestration or meta scheduling, but some level of higher scheduling to figure out, is this going to land, on-prem? Is this going to go to a different system on-prem or a different data center? Or is this going to cloud? How are we going to deal with availability regions of cloud? And how are we going to do all of this in a way that honestly focuses on making science better and research better, and not increase the barrier of entry, but lower that barrier of entry? And how do we do that across clouds? So again, I'm a little bit biased because that's what we've been working on. But yeah, that's where I see the future of this really needs to go. I don't believe that it should be either or, on-prem or cloud. I get it that that's how we're approaching it right now, because I think a lot of the tools still need to be better. But I think in the future, I think it'd be better to hybridize it all and to merge it all into virtual systems, federated systems.
Thank you, Greg. John, where do you see the future of cloud?
I still get Nigerian Prince spam. And so I assume, since I still get that scam still works. So I have no doubt cloud will be popular in the future, because there's a sucker born every minute.
Thank you.
Yeah, more seriously, we're using it as a tape archive. We basically, rather than buy tape, we put stuff in deep archive. And so there's certainly plenty of legitimate use cases about the cloud. But the bursting into the cloud and standing up entire big, large-scale infrastructures in the cloud, that's very dependent on available finances. And it's all fun and games the last 5 years, 6 years, because we've been in a bubble. That bubble bursts, that money to spend on cloud is going to go away. And when people start tightening their budget, that's going to be the first thing that they cut. And they'll either start doing it on-prem cheaper, or they'll not do that work because they just don't have the budget for it. So it'll always be there. It's got its uses, but for these large projects, I think that's always going to depend on the financial backing behind it and the ability to waste money.
Quick follow-up on that. Do you need to extend your auto insurance or auto warranty? Curious. I get that one more than anything else at this point.
I'm going to be responsible for paying for all of my own car repairs.
That's what happens when you have an on-prem car.
You need a cloud car.
Gary, I think you had something you want to add.
Yeah, I did. And thanks. I think I don't know if we had hit it hard enough, but I do want to say something about the cloud versus on-prem costs. And the reason being that, we had done an extensive study recently on that cost at Berkeley Laboratory. We did it about 11 years ago. It was done at NERSC, the Magellan project. There was a paper on that. But now we're at the point where we're at the limits of our current data center, and we would have to make some large capital investments in a new data center, a modular data center. And so it comes you're like, okay, now your due diligence, like, okay, let's look at the cost of cloud versus on-prem. So before I say what we found out, I'll say that, we have 20 years of experience of buying hardware and software. So we know what the hardware investment is, over a sustained period of time. And then the same with the data center. The data center has gone through several upgrades, including a recent $4 million upgrade to, replace the transformers, add a chiller, so that this way we can get some additional capacity out of that. So I included all those costs, with the labor costs and cybersecurity. But, to cut to the chase, if I look at amount of what we deliver in cycles and storage, not capacity, just what we actually deliver to researchers, it's about, at list price, is 5 times more expensive in a cloud. And with our institutional discounts, it works out to be about 4 times as much. And then if you try to whittle that down further and use like reserved instances or committed instances, you can get it down to like 3x. There's even a paper, I think Fermilab had a paper out there, if you go look it up, and they were really they said, okay, we're only going to do high throughput workloads. We're only going to use spot instances where we can get it at 25% of the price. They made all these kind of concessions to the workload, and the best they could do is make it 1.5 times as cloud was still 1.5 times more than the on-prem cost. After we had done this, then we had talked to some other institutions. And so there are some other large institutions who took a similar approach, and they came up with similar numbers. So I feel pretty good about the analysis. People are interested, I can walk them through it. But I did want to say something about the cost, because, about an analysis that we did that we thought was pretty thorough.
That's great, Gary, because Donovan actually has a question. Donovan Campbell asked, how do we predict future costs and how to migrate? So I think that's maybe a sidebar conversation, but that is a great question. Sorry, Gary.
Oh, that's it. I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Nope. And we are right up at the end of time, guys. I'm sorry to kind of cut it off, but I want to be respectful. I appreciate Gary, John, as always, really appreciate your time. Greg, Jonathan, Forrest, it's always good to see you. Thanks for stopping by. Guys, if you like this, go like and subscribe. We enjoy the interaction with you, and we're looking forward to next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, you.